Episode 18, The Expert on Experts, Anders Ericsson. Welcome to The Art of Excellence, a show about people doing extraordinary things in their lives. I'm your host, Glenn Zweig. Thanks for joining me. My guest today is Anders Ericsson. Anders is a professor of psychology at Florida State University, where he specializes in the science of peak performance. His groundbreaking research has been featured in many publications, including Scientific American, Time, Fortune, Wall Street Journal, and New York Times. His most recent book, which he co-authored with Robert Poole, is called Peak: Secrets from the New Science of Expertise. Anders, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the show.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited.
Not as much as I am, I'll tell you that. Before we dive into the details of your work, I'm curious what prompted you to devote your career to studying human achievement. Is there a backstory there?
Well, and I think it depends on how far back you want to go. But I would say that, always I was kind of interested in trying to do something. I guess one of my first passions was to be a kind of a explorer, where I would basically find a new place on Earth that, I would be able to discover. But as I grew older, I realized that people were kind of discovering all these places. So I kind of got more interested in science. And I see sort of science as that ultimate frontier that is going to be around. The frontier may be moving, but we're always going to have that opportunity of understanding new things. So basically, that's a kind of then combination between me wanting to do my best by studying other people. And in particular, I was interested in this method of having people think out loud as a way of understanding what they're thinking about, especially when we're talking about people who are doing exceptional things. And that has been sort of a focus of mine now for decades.
Malcolm Gladwell did a pretty nice job popularizing some of your research in his book Outliers, where he wrote about this 10,000-hour rule. That is, it takes 10,000 hours of practice to become world-class at anything. But in reality, it's not just about thousands of hours of your garden variety kind of practice, but rather thousands of hours of deliberate practice. What exactly do you mean by deliberate practice?
It may be useful to kind of think about an example here and then kind of generalize. So if you go out and jog, pretty much the same routine every day, you're not going to improve very much if you compete in competitions. If you make an effort now specifically to improve, you're kind of pushing yourself, or you're running further than the actual race kind of distance, we would call that purposeful practice. So you're actually doing something with the intention here of improving your race time performance. Now, if you are actually guided now by a coach, somebody who knows the science here of what it is, what type of practice may actually help you, then we call that deliberate practice. So it's kind of a practice activity where you can monitor how you're making progress, so you have immediate feedback. But it's actually a method now that a teacher has been able to, looking at what it is that you can do, recommends now certain types of training activities that are effective and have been effective for other people to improve their performance.
So you mentioned several components of this deliberate practice. You just outlined one of them, which is using a teacher, coach, trainer that can highlight specific areas for you to work on. You had also mentioned that you need to do this work outside of your comfort zone. Talk about that.
Well, if you're going to change what you're doing, and again here, going back to the running example, one of the training activities that have been found to be one of the most effective in improving your running speed is called interval training, where you actually run as fast as you can for, say, 10, 15 seconds. And then you walk to kind of recover, and then you have another burst. And I guess what we've learned now from studying basically physiology and biochemistry is that when you push your body outside of the sort of the comfort zone, you will actually now elicit all sorts of biochemicals. So when you're actually running maximally, you're going outside of what the body really normally can adjust to. And that stimulates these biochemicals in turn, stimulates genes to be expressed. And then these genes will actually change the physiology of your body. And I guess the first thing that you see after about 2-3 weeks is that capillaries are being formed around the muscles. And then over time, you can actually see that the heart and the arteries are actually changing to accommodate transporting a lot of oxygen-rich blood to the relevant muscles.
It's a very apropos example because next week I will be running a marathon, which is the first time I've done this in 20 years. And I've noticed that I've built up the mileage, but my speed is about a minute to a minute and a half slower than it was 20 years ago. I figured it was simply just due to my age and not being quite the specimen I was in my 20s. What's interesting now that you mention that is the one thing I left out this time in my training that I had 20 years ago was the speed work.
And I think that's really interesting because if you look back on the history, it was sort of discovered, I guess, in the early part of the 20th century, this interval training. So before, people were just kind of running the races pretty much the way normal people would do something. And another example that I think is interesting, if you want to increase your ability to dunk the ball in basketball, what people would normally do in order to increase the height of their jump is just to keep jumping, higher and higher. It turns out that you can more effectively improve your jumping height by working with weights. So the kind of stimulation that you can give your muscles when you actually are lifting a weight is much more effective here in causing these changes physiologically that is then allowing for you to actually improve your jump height. Another thing that's also effective is to jump from a height down to the ground. When you absorb your height, your muscles will be stimulated, which in turn, over time, translates to your ability of actually jumping higher.
So are you telling me that I can learn to dunk the ball?
Well,
I mean, this is fantastic news.
I'd be kind of surprised here if the right trainer wouldn't be able to help you.
That's good to hear. I want to touch upon one other aspect of deliberate practice that you highlight in the book, which is that it depends on effective mental representations.
Well, I think some people almost view that when you're learning things, you're kind of automating it. So it's almost becoming unconscious to you when you're doing it. And what we're finding is that experts, they are actually having a much clearer picture of what it is that's going on around them. And that basically is now happening in their head. So if you take, say, a team sport like basketball, what you see is a very good basketball player turning their heads so they actually will be able to monitor where all the different players are and also where they're going. Given that you can only see part of the field, that's really critical that once you get the ball, that you know what to do with it so you can effectively pass it to somebody who might have an opportunity to score. So one way of thinking about mental representations is just to close your eyes and now see how much of that information that's out there do you actually have access to in the brain. We also know that once you have generated that picture in your mind, typically if you're a musician or a chess player, you can now manipulate that and basically make all sorts of transformations and changes so you would be able to figure out, well, if I make this move, what is the best counter move that my opponent can make? And if he does that or she does that, I will do this move. So basically having that kind of possibility here of recreating and manipulating the real world in your mind, that I guess would be sort of what we talk about when we think about representations. And what's interesting is that acquiring that ability of actually being able to, have a complete picture and being able to predict for the next second where other players are going to be, that is maybe the key to being a very successful and skillful basketball player or other type of athlete.
And that can be taught.
That can be learned. So basically, I guess what we argue is that if you listen to lectures, basically what people find, even when lectures are given to medical doctors, they don't change their practice after hearing all sorts of new things. There seems to be that there's this extra step of actually thinking about, if I'm going to change something in my practice where I can now get the benefits of this new medication or treatment, how do we actually change what's going on? So you actually have to interpret basically the information and know making it your own. And that's basically where we see kind of purposeful and deliberate practice as being so important. It's basically that you're encountering a lot of situations, and by actually realizing, like, for example, if you select a chess move that's not the best for a given position, if you know what the correct move is, you can now go back to how you tried to generate that initial move and ask yourself, why didn't I think about this other move? Or why didn't I see how beneficial that particular move would be? And now you're making repairs to how you're thinking. And by actually encountering a lot of situations to get immediate feedback, we see a lot of people improving their performance dramatically.
You discuss in the book how back in the 60s, when we were losing too many fighter jets, the Navy incorporated elements of this deliberate practice into the then newly created Navy Fighter Weapons School, more popularly known as Topgun. The new program completely turned things around for the United States. Talk about the development of that Topgun program. What exactly was broken with the old teaching methods, and how did they fix it?
Well, one of the problems is if you're a fighter pilot and you're a beginner and now you're encountering a more experienced fighter pilot, the odds are that you're going to be shot down. And in fact, when they actually look at the probability of being shot down, it actually decreases dramatically after the number of successful missions that you have. But that creates a problem, right? So if you're going to be really experienced, you need to live through all these encounters. So if you could now provide the same type of information without actually pilots getting killed, you could actually now elevate the performance of pilots. And that's exactly what they did in the Top Gun school. So they were, fighting in Vietnam where they were facing MiG jet airplanes. And what they did was to actually get some of these MiG planes under various circumstances. So now they could actually train American pilots to fly these MiG planes in the way that basically the Vietnamese pilots were trained. And now you could actually get a chance here, if you're a pilot, to encounter basically these MiG pilots. Instead of shooting bullets, you would actually just film it. So by providing now days where you actually had these experiences in the morning, then in the afternoon you would watch these films and actually be able now to learn what it is that you did maybe suboptimally, and then basically having them in this environment for 3, 4 to 6 weeks actually now produced experienced pilots that had the experience comparable to other pilots who had actually survived all these encounters. And what that actually meant was that the loss of airplanes in the Navy, which was the only one who did this, the Air Force didn't do it. Basically, what they found was that the Air Force had the same ratio where they actually lost planes, whereas the Navy dramatically reduced the number of planes that they lost per mission. So this is kind of a way here of creating almost the real world experience where you can now get immediate feedback. Now, when you're actually, as a pilot, there is going to be a delay here until you can watch the film.
But hang on a second. Anders, why not replicate it? I mean, other countries can do the same thing. It seems so intuitive. You simulate the real world environment and then you watch film and you see where you made mistakes and you correct it. Is it that hard to put that together that the Vietnamese couldn't do it?
Well, the Vietnamese didn't do it, and not even the Air Force did it. And basically, as a result, they had much more unfavorable outcomes with their, interactions with the Vietnamese pilots and their MiG planes. But I think if you look at sports, and now I think virtually all of the international sort of sports teams are using videos as a way here of kind of finding ways of training your ability to actually read game situations. So basically by watching videos, you can in some ways now ask yourself, well, if I had the ball, what would I do? And if you now actually more carefully review the situation, you will be able to see that you maybe overlooked that there was one player who was actually going to run in and intercept the pass that you were planning to do. So basically, there you can actually use now the videos as an effective way of training. And if you have a library of videos, then you can actually focus in on particular situations so you get a number of applications here where you would be able to train and actually entrench, making sure here that you make corrections that you could then apply when you actually get in an actual game situation.
A lot of your research has focused on memory. Most people can only remember about 7 digits when a string of digits is recited to them at a rate of about 1 digit per second. You ran an experiment where you were able to dramatically expand a student's memory from 7 to upwards of 80 digits. So how was he able to do that? What was the technique?
So at that time when we started that study, we knew that you could improve basically your ability to maybe go up to 10, 12 digits. But we were interested in, could you actually go further? So that was a study where there was a trial, we presented the digits, he recalled, and if he got it right, we added a digit. So we constantly would kind of get at his boundary. But then we asked him to give a retrospective report. What were you thinking about when you actually heard the digits? And that's where we could uncover that this first subject that we trained, he blocked them into groups of 3 digits, and then he thought of them in a meaningful way. And he was a runner, so 4 to 7 would be 4 minutes and 27 mile time that he was familiar with. So he could actually now, instead of just rehearsing them, basically store that in memory. And as he got more skilled, he could do that with a series of groups. And I think the point is not so much because who would want to memorize long digits of random numbers? That's not very helpful in most jobs. But what is kind of, I think, most important is memory. If you're relying on meaningful associations, you can dramatically improve now the amount of information that you can have available. So we see, for example, with chess masters, if they glance at a chess position for 5 seconds, some of them can actually reproduce it perfectly, whereas a beginning chess player maybe can only recall 4 or 5 pieces and their location. And we see that consistently across domains. I mentioned a little bit the basketball player who actually, knew if he closed his eyes, where the other players were. Well, that's a reflection now of his enhanced memory. And what's interesting is that these superior memories are very specific. So if you actually take a basketball player and show them chess positions, they wouldn't basically do better. And similarly, if you have a chess master looking at basketball game situations, he would not match the expert basketball player and his or her ability to actually, recall where the location of the various players were in a given instant.
So it's very contextually driven. So when we think about things like, I guess, chess and memory and other mental exercises, we commonly use the colloquial phrase to expand your mind, but we don't generally mean it literally. But should we? So when one starts to devote significant time toward a new endeavor, are there parts of the brain which are actually growing in size, much like muscle tissue expanding when we lift weights?
There's clearly this biological change. And I think we have now demonstrated myelinization of various portions of the brain as being associated with development of skill. But I think we don't totally know exactly how the brain is organized, but I think it's safe to say that, we're not proposing anything magical, but basically any kind of performance change that we can actually observe will now be associated with some physiological change. And I guess for most interesting skills, the brain would be the core, organ that basically is able to now implement this change. But I think it's interesting. I mean, most people realize that if you wanted to build your muscles, it's going to take time. Now, when it comes to the brain, it's sort of the same thing, that certain types of processes will take a lot of time. And I think that's one of the things that we agree with Malcolm Gladwell, was his point is, that even when you look at the most successful people, they've spent a tremendous amount of time, and we would argue in sort of deliberate practice type of activities, where ideally you have a teacher who can actually help you build the structure that you want. And one way of thinking about it, if you think of skill as a house, well, it's going to be really important that when you lay the foundation, that you know how many stories you would want to build. And we see that is often a really limiting factor in many individuals, that they did not get the help by a teacher to lay down that foundation that really allowed them then to add on increasingly more complex skills on top of that.
Is it a use it or lose it type of proposition? So just as muscle fiber will degrade over time if you stop working out, stop lifting weights, does the brain work in the same way? That once you cut back this intense, deliberate practice, that you're going to lose what took so long to build up?
We basically, when you look at expert level musicians and basically also chess players, I think it's very clear that if you kind of stop or reduce the amount of training that you're doing, you will actually, lose your ability. And I think that's even maybe more clearly shown in, say, athletes, that the heart changes that Olympic athletes develop as a function of training. If you go back 10 years later and look at athletes that did not continue that intense level of training, the hearts have now reverted back to kind of normal values. So it's sort of like, your body is trying to economize. And I guess a good example is that if you're up in space and weightlessness, there's a lot of bodily changes that will happen that makes it actually very difficult if you don't. Now they're actually having setups where they can actually train up in space. But initially, when these astronauts came down to Earth, they could hardly stand up because basically their muscles had adapted to this, environment where they really didn't need to have the kind of strength that are necessary when you're encountering real gravity.
When your book, you essentially refute the notion that there's any such thing as natural talent. But we've all known people who can pick up a new sport, a musical instrument perhaps, much more readily than others. I mean, just look at people with beautiful voices that have never taken any lessons whatsoever. So do you not feel that there are any genetic differences that can play any sort of role with human performance?
I think the way I want to put it is that we've been looking for aspects that are necessary to be successful in various domains of expertise, and find things that don't seem to be amenable to training. And I think the most solid evidence is for length of bones and height, that basically you're not going to be able to train to become a 7-foot person, or, I guess in some sports like gymnastics, it's very favorable to be short. I think people know the processes that are involved in changing bones. So you can actually change the diameter of a bone, but you can't change the length. So for example, tennis players, their playing arm is much thicker than their non-playing arm. And that's understood here, that every time when you hit the ball hard, it's actually creating vibrations, which now releases biochemicals that are actually stimulating the growth or the increase of diameter of the bone. Now, are there other things that we eventually will find to be genetically determined? Well, to be a scientist, I just have to say we don't know. But what I have been able to say is I've looked at a lot of evidence, and so far I've not found evidence that there are basically these necessary genes, and that it's really meaningful to go out to look for natural talent. Maybe one thing that I think is maybe most relevant is that what we found is that if you do perform well on tests of IQ or other cognitive ability tests, that actually gives you an advantage to learn things. So as a beginner, you're going to do better than other people. But what's interesting is that when you make the commitment of being really good, now basically that correlation with IQ disappears. And I've basically heard parents of gifted individuals, and there seems to be this sort of tendency of gifted individuals to start new things because they're really good at that. But, being a very successful person in an adult world, that's not really the way that you typically, reach to the highest levels in domains. You need that extended process, which doesn't seem to be correlated with whatever you're doing on IQ tests.
So Anders, you and I are going to run an experiment. We're going to take 100 kids, same age, same size, same IQ, same everything. And starting today, they're going to go spend 10, 12, 15,000 hours, whatever the right number is, of deliberate practice over the next decade on some activity. Okay, let's say it's the violin. They've all got the same teacher. They're all going to use the exact same quality and quantity of practice over that decade. And after a decade, we're going to rank the then adults. What's going to separate the adult who's ranked top in the class from the one who's dead last?
Well, I think you're pointing to an issue. And I think if I knew how to motivate any child to engage in deliberate practice on an assigned task, like this music making task, then I would actually have a secret that I think would totally transform the world. What we're finding is that getting a child to actually do this intense concentration on a task and getting them motivated and providing now an environment that actually sustain their interest and concentration level for years, that's really difficult. And I think what I've been trying to do, which is a much easier problem, if we just allowed children at school age to become really good at something, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the same thing, but in the process of getting really good, working with teachers and knowing basically when you should be practicing so you can actually do it at 100% and never prolong the practice beyond when you can actually concentrate fully, then you can actually, in some ways, understand your potential. So if you're an adult, want to excel in your profession, then you can apply these principles. And I think today, at least that's what some of the evidence, people asking children, a lot of children, they don't even have a sense here of what it entails to engage in deliberate practice and what they actually will be able to do to change their performance if they engaged in that type of practice for many years. So unfortunately, I don't think that even in a country, a fully dictatorial country where you would just remove the children and then basically force them to do this, that you would be able to actually engage them. Because that's the problem, that if the child is more or less viewing you as an enemy, they're not going to engage in deliberate practice and they're not going to improve. I think it's interesting. A horse trainer once told me that if you push a horse so hard that the horse actually views you as an enemy, at that point, you're not going to be able to train that horse anymore. They're going to just more or less turn against you. And I think, unfortunately, there are some parents who are really not, really trying to foster children's interest in a domain, and where you actually try to get the child increasingly to take responsibility for their own training and how long they should train, and basically allowing them to get the fruits of the high skills where they can play music for themselves and for other people to enjoy. So once you actually look at that bigger picture, and maybe if we had tremendous amount of resources, we might be able to create something that would more approximate that environment where a number of children are given kind of that opportunity to develop with all the best knowledge that we have about how you would help the child develop their own abilities.
Well, maybe it goes back to this idea of natural talent. If we believe in natural talent and you think your child doesn't have it, then I suppose a lot of parents just sort of wave the white flag and give up.
Yeah, and it's not just the parents. I think a lot of children who don't particularly enjoy, engaging in this music, for them it's relief to basically say, I don't have any talent, don't make me do this. Also, music teachers, they don't want to basically deal with children that are not motivated. So they much rather, restrict themselves to children that are talented, who are spontaneously now engaging in the practice and making the kind of progress that you would ideally want to see in a child.
What's encouraging to hear that humans have the capacity to improve performance at just about anything. I'm wondering, does the improvement become increasingly difficult as we age? Is the brain of a child not able to absorb new material more quickly than an adult? A foreign language, for example.
My feeling is that we're starting to learn, and I'm now being in contact with older individuals who basically say, well, I'm really excited here. I'm going to find a teacher and I'm going to explore this. Because I think the problem is that people just kind of assumed here that it was basically a lost cause. And obviously, if you don't try, you're not suddenly going to develop these skills without that, concentrated and organized practice work. And I think we're finding now that there are certain things that are linked to development. So, for example, perfect pitch, the ability to actually listen to a tone in isolation and be able to say what note it is, that seems to be an ability that any child can acquire, but they can only acquire it between ages 3 and 5. If you haven't acquired it at age 5, the brain will now reorganize around relative pitch, where you actually are judging the relationship between tones. And I think there's a number of these discoveries that once you're starting to ask now, what are the limiting factors? We know, for example, in ballet that your turnout is determined now by basically your hip joints. They are being kind of made permanent during the calcification process between ages 10 and 12. So there you have a window. And if you're trying as a 45-year-old to change that, you're going to just run into serious problems. But, I see this new frontier of new questions and looking forward to in the next decades that we'll learn a lot about basically if there are some limits. What I'm arguing for is that people document their process. So if you were to see somebody who was 65 and could actually now be with videos, document how his language ability, speaking Japanese or Chinese, how that actually developed, it's almost like we need exemplars. And I think the exemplars will tell us some of these skills take a long time. They take a long time even for a child. And the worst thing is that if you basically believe here that in the next 2 or 3 weeks, you're going to learn to speak fluent Chinese, that's basically a misconception that is just going to hurt any efforts that you want to make to learn that. And I think there's a lot of knowledge that we will be able to accumulate so people can make intelligent decisions about, I want to do this, and here's 20 people who previously have done this, and this is kind of what it took for them to get to that point.
When all of your years of studying world-class talent, do you find that once they finally reach the pinnacle in their fields, after years and thousands upon thousands of hours of deliberate practice, they're pretty happy? Or are they often victims of their own success? And they do it because at that point, after 10, 12, 15, 20 years, it's all they know, even though they might be miserable inside.
I have to say that the expert performers that are really sort of successful that I've met and talked to, I find that they, at least in my mind, are fascinating people. And they're very, aware, attuned to how they feel because they know that if they're going to practice in an intelligent way, you need to be really attuned here that you get the right amount of sleep. You basically are taking care of yourself and you're making sure here that you have time for relaxation and stuff like that. And I find, that they do never stop. It's more that, part of being an expert is to try to be one step better, and try to improve something. And maybe at some point you might be spending more time helping younger individuals, improve because basically, that is giving you more satisfaction than basically trying to change anything that you're currently doing. But I don't know. I think in my own case, I'm always feeling here, that tomorrow and basically the next upcoming year, is going to be the most exciting year of my life. And I'm going to try to live it that way.
Let's talk about the workplace. If performance improvement requires this intense level of concentration, then are our workdays actually too long? I mean, there's no way most people can sustain that kind of focus for 8, 10, 12 hours a day.
Exactly. And I guess we find, that about 4 or 5 hours a day seems to be the maximum that, for example, authors can be able to write, when they're really trying to do quality products. And that seems to be kind of a limit that I've seen, in all sorts of domains. Now, there's a lot of work that probably doesn't require that concentration and where you're actually trying now to do something better than what you have been doing. So I'm sure, that a sales clerk or something in a big department store, I think basically their demands, I think if they pay attention to their customers, they might actually provide a very much more enjoyable experience for the customers than if they're basically, not paying attention. But I think that most jobs are not of the nature here that you would have the writer or the musician who is now actually working on trying to master a new piece or basically improving their technical skills. So that kind of high concentration time is only going to be part of it. And if you have a job that basically requires mostly that type of time, then I would argue that if you try to do more than 3 to 5 hours a day, I would be very surprised if you don't burn yourself out. And basically, in some ways, you're going to have problems with sleeping and being rested the next day. And there's a lot of people who kind of tried to expand on the amount of time because a lot of people are impatient. But when they look at what they're producing, often when they're extending, going beyond those 3 or 4 hours, it's not the same quality that they can produce during their best time of the day. So it's sort of a waste of time because they may spend more time revising what they wrote here during those extra hours than basically they're gaining from what was actually produced.
Why do you think more companies aren't implementing training systems that incorporate deliberate practice? I mean, it seems so commonsensical on the surface. Is it just about they don't know about it, or it's really hard to implement? Or is it more that there's no objective standard like you have with the violin or maybe with certain sports, and so therefore you can't really, create those types of training systems?
That's a great question. And I guess I would say that I now am in sort of interaction and talking to basically a handful of companies that are really interested in trying to see here, what is it that we can do and actually in some ways improve the experience of employees and basically providing more productive teams and providing kind of a meaningful job experience for everyone involved. Because I think that, just going on automatic pilot would, to me, be almost like a prison sentence. So creating jobs where you're in some ways are given now time to kind of push yourself, because some of this skill acquisition is very difficult to do when you're actually engaged. And I think most people wouldn't want to have a surgeon that is practicing on patients. When they're actually dealing with patients, you would like them to basically do the best possible job that they can. And the same thing, if you're looking at professional athletes, you don't want them to kind of practice when they're, trying to win the gold medal. You're basically, when you're competing, that's a different thing from when you're actually practicing, where you're actually now able to kind of make adjustments. And I'm optimistic here that over time, there's going to be more companies that are going to actually see the value and the benefits of incorporating these ideas. But, I guess time will tell.
When you talk about pushing yourself beyond your comfort zone, it sounds like this other concept called the flow state that I'm sure you're familiar with. But my understanding of the flow state is that you're essentially in the zone. It's a very positive emotional state. But deliberate practice is more just like really hard work, that there's nothing that enjoyable as you're doing it in the moment. Could you maybe clarify, reconcile these two?
Oh, I think this is a really interesting question that comes up quite frequently. And I would argue that deliberate practice, if you're actually just trying to do things that you're able to do effortlessly, you cannot be engaged in either purposeful or deliberate practice because you're just doing. And I would argue that deliberate practice then requires that you're trying to do something that you can't do. And that it's almost obvious that when you're trying to do something you can't do, you're going to fail, depending on your criteria. You may get closer to the goal and then figure out ways here to kind of stretch yourself, eventually reaching the goal. And that is sort of a process that requires a lot of awareness of what you're doing so you can actually make adjustments. The way I think of flow, and I'm not sure that everyone would agree with me, it's almost like that's the fruit of this practice effort. So if you actually pushed yourself So you now actually can, achieve the goal that you set for yourself without actually having to do all sorts of adjustments. That experience to me would be flow. It's almost like you're now able to do it. And obviously there are other creative situations when you're improvising, maybe with some jazz colleagues, where somehow you're not trying to force anything, but you're just allowing it to happen. And I think that's interesting. And even Csikszentmihalyi agrees that you can never experience flow right now, because if you feel like you're in flow, that actually is inconsistent with the flow experience. So it's almost necessary that you experience flow after you've kind of completed the activity. But, I think we don't know enough about that. And I'm really excited here to talk to some researchers here about the possibility of doing a little bit more research that would kind of clarify, because it turns out that flow is relatively rare. A lot of people would want to feel flow all the time, but when you actually measure here how often they have those experiences, it's quite rare and sometimes unpredictable.
Well, there may be some truth to the fact that most people don't push themselves to the point where they have the opportunity to experience it. I think most people go through life just sort of living in their comfort zone, and so they can't have that chance.
Well, and I think basically my personal belief is that flow happens when somebody is prepared, to perform, and then basically they're able to execute without having to make a lot of conscious corrections. And what's interesting about that is that if you have that, quote, perfect execution, once you're done and you're actually thinking back, there's really nothing that you remember from it because it's so aligned to what you were striving for. And most people, when they perform, they can recall all sorts of problems, areas that they had at various points. But if that is not there, you have that sense of basically no effort because you didn't have to correct it, but you still have that energy that you basically accumulated to kind of be able to deal with any kind of problems. So when you get to the end, there's this kind of release that I think, to me anyway, matches my own experiences of flow.
Well, speaking of your own experiences, do you personally practice what you preach? Do you incorporate deliberate practice in your teaching, your researching, the writing, everything that you do?
Well, I think I try, but, there's sort of limited time. And I guess, at least to me here in the last 4 or 5 years, time is a really constraint. But I think that the first step, which I think is an important one, is to collect feedback. And only then will you actually have the stimulus for changing. And one thing that I have tried to do is to contact people that, have different opinions from me, just to kind of understand how they're thinking. So I would know here, is there something that I have missed? And the same way when it comes to students, I, have a lot of questionnaires where I try to get their feedback on what I'm doing. And then I try to respond to it. Sometimes you would even find here that some students feel that I'm going too slow, but then the other half feels it's going too fast. So basically, how do you make everyone happy? But I think that idea here of really seeking out to get feedback, at least give you the opportunity here of deciding here if you can do something that would actually improve basically what you're providing here, whether it's teaching, writing, or whatever.
As I'm listening to this and processing all this, it seems that there's another component that's just sort of implicit here with deliberate practice, which is the ability to be vulnerable. I mean, you have to basically take feedback, and the feedback is a critique, things you're not doing well. And a lot of people don't want to hear about the things they're not doing well. They want to hear about the things they are doing well. And so they're not open to that critique. They tune it out and they keep doing what they're doing so they can have a sense of, it's sort of their ego at work, that they feel good about what they're doing. And there's no need to change their habits, especially once they've been doing whatever they're doing for years and years.
I think you're absolutely correct. Now, I would argue that we're looking at objectively reproducible performance. So, in a sense, by actually defining expert performance that way, it's kind of hard now to find individuals who have tremendous weaknesses. And so if you're basically a boxer and you have this tremendous weakness, you're not going to win any championships because basically your opponents are going to identify your weakness and capitalize on it and defeat you. So I think, and I think that's why being an expert, it's necessary that you get in touch here with what you actually able to do. And then once you see that, you can, ideally with the help of a teacher, identify things that you can actually improve. But it's almost like, by definition, you have an objective, anchored a kind of description of what you can and can't do. And I think that's kind of a key. And it also gives a lot of self-confidence, because if you know that you have a lot of weaknesses that might be exposed at some point, unpredictable point in time, I think that's going to make you feel less confident. If you understand what you can and can't do, then that almost buys you that confidence that, you know, you're not going to be surprised.
The name of this podcast is called The Art of Excellence. What's your definition of excellence?
I don't personally use that term because it's often kind of used almost like other people are giving evaluations of somebody's performance. So I'm more anchored in this kind of idea of objectively reproducible performance where, but indirectly I would say that if you are a surgeon and you can actually now conduct surgery with better patient outcomes, I would say that is an example of excellence, but I'm kind of less interested in definitions of excellence where you don't really know what is objectively superior. It's more like kind of a rating here of social, you know, the number of followers you have or the amount of money or whatever, these social criteria. So if you can pinpoint, you know, what it is that a given individual can do better than the vast majority of other people, then, and ideally, if that performance is directed to something that's societally valuable, that I think would be excellence in my mind.
That's great. We will wrap it up on that note. Anders, this has been incredibly enlightening. Thank you so much for spending the time with me.
Well, thank you. I was really impressed here with the kind of themes that you picked out, and this was really a very enjoyable experience for me. So thank you.
Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. You can subscribe to the show at iTunes, Stitcher, and theartofexcellence.com. I've got one small favor to ask. If you like the show, please take a minute and leave us a review on iTunes. I would really appreciate that. I'll see you next time.